Welcome to the Data Protection Starts with Data Classification session. Hello, I'm Carla Zuehlke. Recently, I just joined the Statewide Technology Recovery Program Manager for the California Information Security Office. Happy to hear me? Okay. Once again, I'm Carla Zuehlke. Prior to this position, I worked for the Office of Systems Integration, and I was an information security officer as well as their DR coordinator, and even for a few years, their privacy officer. So how many here are primarily in the security field? How many here are primarily in the privacy field? And how many here wear lots of hats and deal with everything? Yeah. Okay, I can relate. I can relate. Today, my role here is to go over the State Administrative Manual 5305.5 for the data classification and categorization. We may have some new ISOs or new privacy officers or small departments. And then again, I think for some of us veterans, it's good to remind ourselves of what our real responsibilities are when it comes to privacy and security and that data classification and why it's important. So I'll briefly go over that, and then we'll hand it over to Devin Cambridge from FirstData. Everything's duplicated. So the State Administrative Manual, Section 5305.5, Information Asset Management, requires that each state entity must understand the value of their information assets, and they shall establish and maintain an inventory of all of its information assets. And it's important part here, it's important to classify both electronic and paper. We all probably have HR departments that are still working with paper documents that have people's names, social security numbers, personal information that's confidential and needs to be classified as confidential, and personal identifiable information, PII. So that's why you see most of our HR departments, locked in their offices within a locked office, within a locked building. You compare that to some of the agencies I've been at where the executed contracts, the papers are all in file cabinets all along the hallway, okay? Not protected, they're public. But I do want to kind of put a side note here that just because you've classified it as public, that document can have sensitive or confidential information within that public document that you can redact and should be redacting prior to public distribution. Let's see if I can get my slides to go down. Okay, there's a lot on this slide, I know, sorry. But you'll need to work the information asset owners need to work very closely with your privacy officer and your security officer and potentially your legal office to ensure that you have your specific type of information within your department. Information assets for your department are classified correctly and correctly under the government and civil codes such as the PRA, the California Public Records Act, and the Information Practices Act of 1977, as well as the FIPS, the Federal Information Processing Standards, FIPS 199. Another reference that I always use to help me when working with business to classify data and categorize systems was the NIST 860, the Guide for Mapping Types of Information and Information Systems to Security Categories. At OSI, we were primarily custodians of data for large systems, and so I worked with our procurement office to make sure that FIPS 199 was in our IAA templates, or IAT templates, so that the actual business owners, that was their responsibility to tell us and categorize their system and help us with that data, since they know the importance of that information asset. And then we would help them classify the information under the government codes. Also, in my situation as an ISO, Public Record Acts became much more coordinated between security and privacy and legal when the PRA Government Code 625419, that new exemption came in, that was added, and it exempts disclosure of information security records of a public agency if, on the facts of that particular case, disclosure of that record would reveal vulnerabilities to or otherwise increase the potential for attack on an IT system, a public agency. So I had been able to work with our legal to ensure that network diagrams, our DR plans, IP addresses, some of those RFPs that have been in place in contracts for years, when that current system section of the RFP has some very critical system information that you need to take a look at when you get these kind of PRAs, and you can and work with your legal to make sure they get redacted before public release. Okay. So SAM and the state policy and standards points to the Federal Information Processing Standards, FIPS 199, which requires that information assets be categorized either as low, moderate, or high, which is based on the rated level of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, commonly known as CIA. Once you have the information asset categorized, then you can deploy the appropriate level of security controls and privacy controls to the system using the NIST 853 security and privacy controls or other standards for your particular department, whether it's federal tax information or HIPAA or PCI. But you need to do that classification. I know when I've worked with business owners in the past to categorize systems, and we'd be going through that FIPS 199 matrix and decision-making process that's in there. And I'd tell them, well, based on, this decision-making and the type of information, I would, consider it moderate. It meets the moderate. Well, no, it needs to be high. Well, we're not going to build Fort Knox and pay for a Fort Knox when it doesn't warrant it. But on the other hand, when I'd work with a program unit and they wanted to build a 2-foot fence for a mission-critical system, then we'd go back to that decision-making matrix and say, no, we need to build a much higher fence because this is mission-critical and it has data classified as confidential or HIPAA, business associate, or other things that warrant it to be better protected. So that's how you can kind of work with business to get that correct classification and categorization, so you can, when you're doing the requirements of the system, or even with major system changes, you get the right controls in place. Sorry about that. So this slide is a list, and you probably can't read it very well, but this list provides the state entity's responsibilities as defined in the SIM, the State Information Management Manual, 5305A, But how do you go about fulfilling all of these responsibilities is often a very difficult answer. I mean, description of the value, owner of the asset, custodians, classification, the FIPS categorization. It's tough. It's not easy. But since I wore the disaster recovery hat as well, when we were going through and doing the business impact analysis for our technology recovery or disaster, I would just add columns to, the BIA forms when I was having to collect what functions they were doing, what systems supported those functions. I'd add what data is in here, and so I would actually, every business impact analysis would try to classify that information. And that's good for systems, much more difficult for paper, but it's still important. Another area you might check for, these small departments that have not started, or even some of us larger departments that haven't started or haven't completed a data classification or categorization process within our agencies. I've gone out to look at training manuals for systems where I can look at all the screens and see what kind of information they're asking their users to enter into this system. And that's another way where I could go back to business and say, well, this looks like, you're asking for, PII data or, very sensitive data. So that's another suggestion I have. And the classification of data is even more important now that we have our information going mobile and cloud. So business needs to understand that value of that information when you're making your policies for mobility and your security for your cloud. So SAM Section 5305.5, Information Asset Management Data Classification, primarily has information classified as public, confidential, and sensitive, as well, and confidential information broken down to personal, notice triggering, protected health information, electronic health information. I know there's tax information. I know there's HIPAA information. There's justice information. These are examples. Notice triggering, I guess, could be a classification, but it really is that combination of PII data, the name, and the other, like social security number or driver's license or ID or something like that, that causes you to be required to send breach notices out to those people that are impacted. We could spend a whole hour on breach notices and incident management, so I'm going to keep my scope down to the classification piece, but you should know if one of your systems has all of those combinations for notice triggering. Now, sensitive, that was one that always kind of gave me a little trouble. I know what it says in the SAM, but here's an example of a department-specific data classification as sensitive. They included investigative information, pending litigation, notes, drafts, comments on drafts, internal memos, audit emails, confidential communication between attorneys and employees, and any writings that reflects an attorney's impression, conclusion, opinions, and legal. So this is a really good example how a department, used the requirement to classify their data, but made it department specific instead of copying SAM into their policy. I know firsthand the scope of effort on this is big, really, really big. It's tough to identify all the records maintained by your agency, classify them all, categorize all the systems. Some triggers that you may want to talk to you need to talk to your business and asset owners is, what records are your office and staff using and maintaining to support this business function? And this is happening more than we probably realize. Our new employee workforce is very technical savvy, and they are creating their own databases to help them do their work, or their spreadsheets, or other tools that they're creating within the business office that has nothing to do with IT support. They're doing it all themselves. So those are ones that you really need to discover, because those will come back and get you. Let's see. I don't know, I've got doubles. So the state policy also requires that management must assign ownership of information assets, and the program unit should coordinate the following responsibilities with their ISO and privacy officer. Regarding ownership, how many have dealt with, you already have a process in place, but people leave? Do you use your exit process, employee exit process, to transfer those records to somebody else? Or what kind of processes are out there so that you don't wind up in the situation that I did, where we had a notice triggering security incident because a folder wasn't assigned to anyone, and we wanted to do some cleanup, and someone opened it, and there was notice triggering information in that file. And the owner and that creator of that folder hadn't worked in our agency for years. So how do you go, how do you deal with, okay, now I've got this process, I've got my stuff, inventoried. How do you deal with when people leave and that ownership of that data set, information sets? Duplicates. So from a security and privacy perspective, you should eliminate unnecessary collection, use, and maintenance of personal information in state entity records, along with providing the proper notice with the collection of personal information as required by Civil Code Section 1798.17. Be mindful of retention schedules. Why are we protecting data and taking that risk of keeping that data when it could have legally been properly disposed of years ago? That's another area where, it's really good to bring that retention schedules into your data classification categorizations. I know the NIST 853 Revision 4 added Appendix J, the privacy controls, and I highly encourage, if you haven't seen them, to go and read the Appendix J for the 853. Those privacy controls facilitate the organization's effort to comply with privacy requirements, and it is very helpful, and you can kind of check yourself against that J to see how well you're doing in that with that privacy. Information asset owners, in collaboration with ISO and privacy, need to define precautions for controlling access and preserving the security and integrity of information assets. They also need to authorize access to the information in accordance with the classification and the legitimate business need to know and authority for having access. And that's definitely an area where business owners need to get involved in. State policy also requires that you have to identify for each information asset the level of acceptable risk. You also need to monitor and ensure authorized users and custodians are aware and comply with their responsibilities. Risk analysis are so important in communicating the level of risk so program management, executive management can understand the risk and identify that level of acceptable risk for an information asset. And with that, sorry. So going forward, maintain an awareness of record inventory and classification requirements. If once you have a process, you need to maintain it so you don't run into the security incident that we just discussed. And ensure you're only collecting data that you have authority and need to collect. And here is our contact information at the California Information Security Office. Feel free to call us anytime. And now I'm going to turn it over to Devin Cambridge from FirstData, and we'll save time for some questions and answers at the end. So thank you.
Thanks. So I saw we have some security people, some privacy people, some mix of different people. Yeah. And I want to ask you a question. How many people think data classification is the most boring part of security you could ever imagine? So
I got the boring stuff, you get the fun tool stuff.
Well, yeah, I think some of the people that have had to do 2 a.m. sessions trying to get some equipment up would probably disagree with you on that as far as having fun with technology. So let me just introduce myself. I'm Devin Cambridge with FirstData. We're a financial services and security services corporation. If you've swiped your card in the U.S., there's a pretty good chance you swiped it through our systems. So we're on the backside. We do a lot of couple of small companies like Walmart and McDonald's. So we're in the thick of the middle of a lot of this stuff that you're hearing about in the news. We're helping a lot of our customers bring their security up, et cetera. So we've had a long-standing use of security and technology and process procedures, but we're also heavily regulated. So a lot of the stuff that we hope to talk about will apply to your organizations as government organizations, and hopefully you can take away some of the things that we're doing on the forefront with cloud and mobile, and we'll get to that in the end. So you heard, basically in the last presentation you heard, gotta classify. Now the question is, really, why do you have to classify? What can you do with classification? You're probably sitting there staring going, Devin, really, are you going to spend the next 15 minutes talking about digital label making? We're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about that in the future, but let's start again with some of the standards out there for tagging and classifications. So you heard FIPS 199. I'm not going to go through that too much. You can pull it down from the web. NIST creates these guidelines for government systems. NIST 800 is the security framework, and it basically, when we talk about it, this is the data classification tag that they recommend. Now use this as a guideline. So you've heard CIA. CIA's confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So at your system level, what they're really trying to get at is, do you know what type of systems you have, what's on your system, how critical your system is. For the privacy people out there and for the data people, and we're going to go down to the data level, I'm not going to talk about the I or the A. I think that for the most part, your IT teams are probably dealing with that the most. The real part of neglect is the C, the confidentiality. That's why we have so many news events about leakage and exposures and embarrassment. And I think I can safely say for the public sector, you guys are probably more worried about embarrassment than anybody else being in politics. So the standard classification is there. It's the second bullet down. It's the SC, standing for security classification. And what they want you to do is game theory it. They want you to put a number in there that's, after each one of those that says how critical is your system. So you can either do a 0 to 10 or whatever. Their values that they're actually asking for are low, moderate, high, and not applicable. Again, this is where you guys come in. You have to define this. You have to define what makes your system critical or high. Let's get down to the data itself. It can be very daunting to try to take everything and try to implement it. And as you know, trying to get to that stage, if you're trying to do too many factors, you're not going to be successful. So start with one and then start building up. Let me ask everybody here, do you guys know what a CMDB is? Anybody? What's a CMDB? Yeah, our central management database. So we're going to talk about central management database. You need one of these. This basically outlines all your application, who your application owners are, et cetera. We're not talking about the validity of the information on the start out, but you need to build a CMDB, and then you need to get it to where it's more canonical, to where you can go, where everybody can go and say, yes, this is where I get the information. Yes, that's the owner. No, wait, that's not the owner. Let me update that field, et cetera. It's the way your security department and your IT department and your privacy department are going to be able to talk to one another. A lot of times when we're trying to implement these things, we get siloed, and that's what keeps you from actually getting these programs out. So let's go back to the tags. This is the FIPS 199 tag, high, medium, low. I don't like this because it's very hard to implement when we start talking about some of the tools and some of the more advanced things we're going to do. So classification is your way to what I call superfly, super spy. We talked about classification not being sexy, but if you look at what has been developed, a lot of this stuff is coming out of the intel community. So how many people know what a top secret clearance is? Okay. Is there beyond top secret? And what's the beyond top secret called? SCI, security compartmental information or special compartmentalized information. So you've seen on the last slide, I've got the basic 4 types of classifications. I like this. This basically gets your information types in down to 4 types of classifications, and then you can focus in on the last 2, right? Is it restricted and is it confidential? Restricted information is where you're going to apply your most controls and your most advanced controls. Confidential information is what you're going to target after you get your restricted environment under wraps. And then you can start bleeding it down and moving information that accidentally was restricted, that got into internal or public. You're going to try to get that into the restricted zone, and you're going to create a program to do that. So again, there's compartmentalized. That means if you've ever seen the James Bond movies, that's the for your eyes only, right? In other words, this is a group of people that are only supposed to see it. This is your finance department when they're working with financial information, even when they're dropping it into files. So typically what you're dealing with now is a distributed environment. There have been distributed environments for the last 30 years. They are reality. Now we're just distributing to public systems. And the question is what do you do with that restricted information when it's moving all over the place? Centralization is not bad. What you want to try to do is get things centralized and then let it flow out. So you want to take all those other environments, try to find where it's not supposed to be, get it pushed back in, and then when it comes out, you're going to use your tags. because the tools are going to enable you to start to contain that information based off of that. Again, center in on the restricted information first. So let's talk about some of the controls that we have today. So we've talked, you've decided, okay, I'm going to start labeling things restricted or confidential. How am I going to get that implemented in my organization when I know this stuff is living all over the place? You know, it's living on laptops, it's living on cell phones, it's living on everything else. Your first tool that you'll want to invest and look into is your data leakage prevention tool. How many people here have a DLP rolled out? Was it hard to roll out? Did you find it hard to roll out at all? That is, by the way, very typical in most organizations. People get very obsessed with buying tools, figuring that I can set it and forget it. The real security comes in that last 20% of implementation. It really comes in the configuring of it and setting up a program. Once you have a team of analysts, and start small, and start with something small. Start with your, if this got out, this would destroy the company, small, right? And then start working your way and expanding the program out. It does take time, and you're absolutely correct. But the thing that you're going to find is, if you start to use your DLP, you're going to start seeing channels going out to the internet. You're going to start seeing stuff. If it's set up properly, you're going to start seeing stuff go out on email to email servers you didn't even know exist. How many people here know about shadow IT? So shadow IT is field office A sitting outside the corporate environment, decides they want an internet connection because they want to service their customer faster, so they set up an internet connection, not telling the corporate office that there's even a connection there. Next thing that you know, they set up their own email server because their hotshot IT system admin decides he can do it better than anybody else, and since most of, by the way, been that IT person, you can do it better than everybody else, and everybody else is not as smart as you. That's not cooperative, and that's not what organizations are about. We all know that from the top level. So shadow IT happens, and when you start building this out, it'll also start helping with your shadow IT. You should be looking at what's the secondary and tertiary information coming out of your tools. So again, this all started with data classification. What am I seeing going out, what confidentially going out through these channels? So use it as a visibility tool to get a handle of what your organization is actually doing. What are the actuals, not what the budgeted forecast was. Again, most of us know we don't have unlimited resources. I come from a financial services industry. I deal with projects with a lot of money. However, even in a financial services organization, you don't have unlimited resources. Everybody's vying for those resources, just like you're vying for public dollars and budgets, same thing. So again, get moving. When you have that, when you have a tool in place, I would say you're ahead of the game. You already know what you have to do. You have to get somebody in there that can set up the rules properly, and then you have to get somebody, and this is one of the most important things, that's looking at the incidents that are being created. And is pulling somebody smart. What you want is a team that can pull out that secondary and tertiary information that, not just Sally sent an email out and it had this class of data or this type of data and it went out. It was, did Sally do that because nobody was trained? Did Sally do that because we don't have control of our exiting channels? Is Sally doing that because she's trying to get her job done and this was the best way that she could send it to her home account to try to work on it at home? You start to find those business reasons. You start to find those other reasons for why your systems are put in place. And that's the only way to start engaging with your departments on, listen, this is not how we should be doing it.
So you're saying, so didn't we need to first do data inventory? I mean, it's like data inventory, classify data, and then determine how to configure the DLP? So you're just saying turn this on and start scanning the networks to see what's happening?
The latter. Here's the thing. If we lived in a perfect world, and sometimes you get lucky and you get an organization that's on the ball, that understands this, invests in it, and creates a culture around security. But let's be honest. People try to do stuff just to get their jobs done. There are, and I've discovered that most of my employees really do mean the best. They want the company to do well. They want to believe that they're part of an organization that's doing good, that they're doing their best for their company. We do see bad actors, and when you get it more advanced, when you get to a CMMI level 5, where you have a repeatable process, et cetera, you're going to have processes in place that changes the behavior. Hopefully the first phase of doing this is a behavioral change and a cultural change, not a, let me go spank my employees, for lack of a better word. That's not what this is about. This is literally about, protecting the data, protecting the information, making sure that the information is appropriately used. As government agencies, you have some very critical information. As employees of government agencies, you're authorized to work with that information, or hopefully you've set up the authorization process of determining that, yes, that job function needs access to that information. So that is critical, because the last thing you want is to put so much of a burden on your organization that it can't get anything done. But yes, back to your point, turn it on and start to and just let it bake. Let it bake for a year. Tony Spinelli over at Equifax, when he first went in, he did exactly that when he implemented his DLP. And he'll tell you the first thing, you should let it bake for a year. You should see what's going on in your network, what business processes are out of whack, what are things that you have down on paper that aren't being enforced. You'll get the blocking, that's the next phase. Then you're going to start turning on blocking and saying, no, you know what, we're going to block anything that's going to Salesforce.com. We're going to start blocking anything that goes to, Twitter. We're going to start really looking at who we're going to allow to utilize those services, and we're going to create a channel for them to do that. But it's going to be a limited number. And that's really what you're trying to get down to, is who has appropriate access to this, right? Who should be, does the DMV worker at the end really need to see your HIPAA information? Does your HR people need to see it? You want to get down to those data sets. You want to get your network and your systems under control. So the tags help do that. Your DLP, that's the next phase, is that when you get to that CMMI level 5, you can start inserting tags into documents, and you can start doing a more scalpel approach. So the first thing you're going to do with your DLP is you're going to hit the broader sense, what's happening in my overall organization. Once you get your tagging system under control, you can start inserting tags in things and saying, no, that's not supposed to go outside our network. And that's important when you start talking about cloud and mobile. So again, having your tagging, setting up a tagging scheme, critical. It's really going to enable you to do some really fine security. So how do you automate tagging? Most of the DLP services will do that. It's called sensitive data discovery. For example, if you're looking for PCI cards, you turn it on. You start looking for it on file shares. And trust me, when you hit start with your file shares, because we all know that is the place of the worst violation as far as where your stuff is going to live. Also, make sure you have a place where it's supposed to live with extra controls, encryption controls. So now you're going to have to get, your organization is going to have to get very, very adept at encryption. Normally, you've only been adept with encryption with a VPN or an SSH session. Now you're going to have to start getting down to the data at rest, and I'll tell you that's where most organizations have struggled. We have a very large department. We have a crypto department, key management department. So those are things that, as privacy and security people, you want to really start looking at. All right, so we're coming up to the end of this. I'm going to just rush through here. So identity is the key. This is the cornerstone. So you need a CMDB. You need to make sure your identity and access management systems are up to snuff. If you're going to put in an identity and access management system for sensitive data, layer a second identity and access management system. So if you're just trying to get internal or public information, you don't need to jump through a lot of hoops, excuse me. If you're trying to get at sensitive data, there should be a secondary authentication system outside of typically what is Active Directory. So most people use, let's just be honest, most people use Active Directory for their primary login, and that's fine. That's perfectly good. When you go start talking about, okay, I need to set up a secure file system, and to mount it, I'm going to need to have them type in their password. You're going to want to put something like a certificate access on there, or some other type of authentication system that makes it harder to get into. The slides are going to be available, so these are typical things, reduce the target. When we talk about mobile and cloud, here's the thing. The one thing you can't give up, you can outsource just about anything. The one thing you can't give up is your key management for your cryptography, because that's what's going to enable the cloud, and your identity access management. We've seen a lot of federation going on, and there are a number of attacks, especially when it comes to federated systems. So you've got a contracting company, you come to me and then you say, let's federate, I'm working on this project, okay, great, let me add you, and then somebody else comes and say, hey, I'm going to subcontract. So now you federate with them. So now they set up an account with you, and they basically compromise your system so that it looks like it's coming from you. It's a trust-based attack, right? So now I'm allowing somebody into the system without who I really don't want to authorize, and they're coming in through a malicious third party. So again, get control of your identity and access management systems and really, really tighten that down, because that's the one thing you can't, I would say you really don't want to outsource. And again, the key management systems are, as they say, key. Mobile, there's container technologies now, good. You're going to see extensive development in this arena and a lot of competition for patents. I do recommend an endpoint protection product like Vertisys. They are coming out with an endpoint node that will actually snuff malicious execution and will actually do DLP on it too, so that if you see those tags coming in onto your device, you can get them. So with that, we're kind of up on time, but I just wanted to open it up. Are there any questions as far as some of your fears, some of your concerns as you move forward? Cloud and mobile, you can't avoid it. It's like trying to rip Microsoft Office out of your organization. Most of your attack vectors come through Microsoft Office, but if you try to go to somebody and tell them that they're not going to use Microsoft Office, I would say, get your resume polished, because it's coming. Are there any questions as far as what we've talked about? People a little more jazzed about doing classification now, or? What are some of the challenges you guys have? What are some of the things, what are the things that keep you up at night with regards to confidential information?
Well, one of the issues that we had was when the governor opened up saying that state agencies should be transparent, so we have this transparency issue. So all the things we were looking into that we hadn't opened up yet, Facebook and certain things that we hadn't published data to. And now we using opening up for everyone. And we're like scrambling on the backside now saying, okay, how are we going to stop them from publishing certain data out there that it's
It's,
data that's okay to put out there, coming from certain things that we can publish, but we have no, on the security side, there's no filters or anything that we can put on saying this is classified, this is not, there was no channel, so it's like a scrambling of, okay, who's real perception now? We can backtrack a little bit.
yeah, and you've got the genie in the bottle problem, right? You let it out, and then, if Governor Brown leaves office and somebody comes in and starts freaking out and going, no, 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 then you got to lock it down. The answer is, so you're absolutely correct. Now, there is a technology that does apply to that, and that is you can hook your DLP in through ICAP. If you have what's called a blue coat, do you have blue coat proxies? Or? Well, and so I would say that given the environment that you've just been presented, normally when they say that, so I have a philosophy on security. I've done a lot of consulting. I've done a lot of consulting for the Generally Eclectic Corporation, which is a big monster to deal with when they've got government regulation and then hotshot financial guys and a whole bunch of other stuff. You put it in, I don't believe that as security people, we're in the business to say no. Now, obviously, in your space, you especially don't have the ability to do that. So the answer is yes, you can do that, but this is what's going to cost you. And then you put the blue coats in and you put the labor to put those blue coats into the budget and say, okay, great, transparency costs X amount of dollars. And get them in, and get people proxying through them. So when people are still inside your organization, i.e. inside your boundary, right, which isn't going to go away, you're still going to have firewalls, et cetera, you want the windows out, and you want them to go through those windows, and you want to set up, these are our contract, this is our contract portal, so if you're a contractor, you're going through this set of blue coats, and if you're on the private side, or you're a state employee, you go through this one so that you can watch the traffic. Like I said, once you get your DLP hooked in, your rules will kick off. And blue coats actually have some capability to do a DLP out of the box. So you may want to look at that and have your guys configure the rule sets for that. And again, get down to what are we going to block. And if you can insert a tag, the blue coats can stop that too. Like, oh, I'm seeing this tag, I'm not allowing out. Let's be honest, the NSA does this, right? Government contractors have been doing this for years. When we talk about compartmentalized information, if they see a compartmentalized tag, it gets taken out. The next phase on more advanced stuff is to actually redact it, right, on the way out. So that if you're going to a website or something like that and you're posting, the last four, the only part of the card number you see is the last four digits. Now you can do that for any type of data type. You just have to make sure you've got the proper personnel creating those rule sets. But it's doable.
We just assign data stewards so that if anything is posted, they
Yeah, responsibility is a tough act. Anyways, thank you folks for showing up. Really appreciate it. Hopefully this was useful. Enjoy the rest of the conference.